Hi, guys, and welcome to the Space Opera panel. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Very excited. The most excited we'll ever see people get about space opera. We're gonna go down this way, and then we're gonna come back for the next question. So, Ken, you're last and first.
Okay.
But I'm going to go through real quick. I want everyone to introduce yourselves and in that same breath, tell us what you think space opera is in your own words.
According to Wikipedia that I checked this morning, space opera is a dramatization of, and I forgot the rest of it, but space opera, honestly, to me, is the great umbrella where you can be as hard or as soft in science fiction as you possibly can. Was there another part of that question?
Who you are.
Yeah, I forgot about it. I failed that part.
Who are you?
They were going to do the introductions coming from the other end, so thanks for bogarting right in on everybody else.
I wasn't going to tell him that, but that's okay.
I like the initiative.
I do the. See, now you confused me. All right. My name is Ken Lozito. I am the author of 28 novels, and I'm most notably known for the First Colony series.
Hi, I'm not Terry Maggard, and I'm not the author of Backyard Starship.
Oh, can I just, real quick, so Terry Maggart was supposed to be here, but he got the flu. So if you could please reach out to him on Facebook and tell him how much fun you're having here, so that he feels terrible about missing it.
Yeah, Mix is way
Oh
better
yeah,
anyway.
that too.
Yeah. Tell him that I'm telling lots of jokes, and I'm very funny.
And Mixon is signing a lot of Backyard Starship novels as not Terry Maggart. All right, and your definition of space opera, please.
It is a grand adventure. I'm not even sure this thing's on. It's a grand adventure in space, and it's the scope of the setting for me and the adventure part that sets up what space opera is for me.
I'm David Weber, and I've written a couple of space operas along the way. I think that space opera, originally space opera meant, it was not an approving term. It was a play on the horse opera, and it was basically you could substitute a cowboy with a 6-gun for the spacer with the blaster, and you had the same story. I think that space opera today, I think it's a definition that largely lies in the eye of the beholder. I'm going to define this as space opera because I like it, or I'm going to define this as space opera because I don't like it. I think that Terry was right that part of it is scale. It tends to deal with existential threats where it's win or you don't get to go home kind of situation. So it's one of the things that space opera does is let you look at the human condition under conditions of maximum stress, I guess, and on a very large scale usually.
I got it. All right. I'm Josh Dalzelle. I've got 3 series out. The one that kind of straddles the line between military, sci-fi, and space opera is the Omega Force series. And writing that, kind of how you define space opera, it tends to be, if fantasy and sci-fi are driving on the same highway together, space opera is that asshole that keeps coming over into fantasy's lane just a little bit at a time and bumping. And so I've found like a lot of space opera books I read always had some sort of fantastical element to it. It could be defined through the technology, but it always had some intangible that wasn't strictly you wouldn't define as hard science fiction. You definitely wouldn't define as military science fiction.
Hi, my name's Chaney, and I work with Terry Mixon, Terry Maggart, who could not be here today, and several other writers collaborate a lot, just like Mr. Weber here. And I work primarily in space opera, but sometimes that crosses over into military sci-fi. Space opera, to me, is less focus on combat, more focus on adventure and exploration. That's the simplest definition and distinction I can make between that and military sci-fi. The next question I'm going to ask is, why do you think space opera specifically, not just sci-fi, but space opera has lasted for so long and so many decades, and why it continues to endure and sell so well today?
It's hard to say. I mean, Star Wars is your quintessential space opera, and a lot of people over the decades have used that as the stick with which they define others at. And so I think space opera makes you nostalgic for a more hopeful type of science fiction, not so much dystopian or drab. It's, you have heroes and you have grand adventures and you have the things that you want to read about, you yearn for. And so I think that kind of appeals to the readers.
I've seen some pretty dystopian space opera, but my personal opinion is the taste for dystopian science fiction or fantasy or space opera is driven more by present dayism being read into the science fiction, okay? Because we feel that we're living in a dystopian time. And therefore, if I'm going to read real science fiction, realistic science fiction, it has to be dystopian and have, in effect, a gloomy view of the future, okay? Most space opera has more of a triumphant view. And that is what human beings truly crave. That is what we look for. It's the reason that I hate dystopian YA books, because kids who are at that most formative moment of their lives do not need to have books that confirm them, it's the second day, confirm them in the view that all adults who aren't incompetent are malevolent. And yet that's the way that a lot of it is written. And I don't want to write that kind. I'm perfectly willing to give you really malevolent characters in my books, okay? But I think that space opera overall believes in the possibility of victory, as opposed to we will always have to accept a flawed conclusion and one that encompasses defeat as well as whatever transitory triumphs we can attain.
I think the reason space opera is still so prevalent today is because people want to have a grand adventure. They want to visit places that they've never seen before, see societies that they couldn't imagine, and they want to be entertained. And at its base, for me, space opera is that triumph of being put under those hard circumstances, like David said, and coming out on top. And it's the wide scale of everything that you're watching as you do it that makes it so appealing.
I think that works. I agree with everything that everyone has said. The space opera for me is, why it's persisted is it's the hero's journey. It's who we aspire to be. It's when heroes are the examples that we aspire to live up to. I write characters that, in real life, I know I would not handle it anywhere near as well as they did, given the circumstances that they're facing. So, there's a reasons why those stories persist, and it caters to the more optimistic viewpoint in finding our place in this universe.
Okay, good answers. Next, I'd like to ask, and then I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to you guys. So start thinking of questions that you would like to ask while we're here.
Don't get to leave till we get necessary.
There's going to be a quiz.
So the next question I have, and we're going to start with Ken and come down, is when you're writing space opera, do you think that there is a necessary amount of combat as opposed to military sci-fi, and what kind of distinction is there between those two subgenres?
Okay, so space opera and combat. No, I don't think there is a required number of battles that need to be fought in space opera. I do think there's, in the plot for any story, you do need conflict and resolution, and that's what is driving your story. So space opera has such a wide umbrella that you can lend itself to the type of story that you're trying to tell. Like if you were doing a heist story in a space opera, well, is he or she going to get the treasure at the end, or is he going to beat the people who were trying to kill him? Things like that. So it really depends on the plot. That's where I'm going to come down in. But if you absolutely must have a number, then go back to Shakespeare and follow the 3-act structure and resolve that with each act that delivers you to the conclusion of the story.
I think that space opera and military science fiction are pretty much kissing cousins. Some people will disagree with me, I'm sure, but the things that I write have elements of military conflict, but it's also space opera. And I don't think that space opera needs to have potentially as much conflict, though it can as far as naval fighting. It is what the story requires, the level of conflict to make it hard for the characters to achieve. If that's fighting, great. If it's stealing something and being thwarted, that's great too.
I think that sometimes if you write military science fiction on a particularly grand scale, you get classified as space opera because of the scale. It's not because of the combat. It's because of the scale of the story that you're writing, and it's because a certain type of reviewer or critic cannot take military science fiction seriously. Okay, I'm sorry, but that's the way that it is. It's kind of like the assumption that if you're in the military, it's because you're too stupid to get into college. Okay, and I'm like, I have a son who's in the Marines in security detachment for the embassy in Jerusalem right now, and a daughter who's going into the National Guard in January, so I don't happen to share that view, you understand. I think that an example of excellent space opera, which includes some combat but isn't driven by the combat, is the Liaden universe, if you're familiar with it. If you're not, shame on you, go get familiar with it. It's very, very good stuff. I think the amount of combat that your space opera needs if you're writing it is the amount of combat that your storytelling voice and style is comfortable with. Okay, you have conflict that you have to have a conflict situation you have to have a struggle that's going to be resolved. It may or may not be conflict with another character. It could be conflict with the universe itself, okay? But there has to be a conflict that is resolved. Okay, the most black and white, stark outcome conflict that you can have is combat, in which there's a winner, there's a loser. You know that you're risking your life, not just your money or whatever in the struggle. And I think that there tends to be something of a default to that sometimes in fiction, not just science fiction either, okay? But the critical thing is the story that you are telling and how you structure a story, how you structure the literary universe in which that story is being set. So it has to work for you. And then the reader will determine whether or not there's enough or too much military conflict in that space opera for that reader. Do you follow what I'm saying? So I think that it would be a mistake for anybody to say, well, there has to be, it's kind of like when you do a movie script, okay? There actually is a formula that they use. You know, the protagonist has to be on screen for X percent of the movie, the secondary characters have to be for X percent of the movie, et cetera. It explains why Hollywood has some of the problems that Hollywood has, if you follow me. You need to follow your voice both for how much screen time your characters get and how much time they spend shooting at each other. That's what I'm saying.
I'd say military sci-fi is, at its core, is finding a military solution to your conflict. The military aspect of that drives the story. It is the story. Space opera, it's not necessarily, it's in the story, but it's not, you can have, I've read space opera with no combat in it, and it tends to be a little more stylized. Military sci-fi is a little more gritty and realistic, and it's analogous to the militaries we have today, and that seems to follow that kind of pattern. And space opera is, I've read stuff with, literally like sailing ships in space, just things like that, where you can let your imagination roll more wild with the combat that way, and I don't want to say it's a supporting feature, but it's not the main driving force of the story.
How many of you watch or have watched Star Trek? A lot of people, right? Good room for that. How many of you specifically are fans of The Next Generation? How many of you have seen the movies? Okay. One thing that I've heard is if you watch the show, that space opera, a lot of conflicts are resolved diplomatically with conversations, very little combat to speak of, occasional phaser fire. But if you watch the movies, I mean, it's straight up mill sci-fi most of the time. You've got Picard running around with a Gatling gun in one movie, solving things with less diplomatic means and more of like, we're all going to go to war with this Borg cube. So I would say that's a pretty simple distinction between the two subgenres, and that show / movie set of movies does a really good job of walking that line. But we're going to take questions from the audience now.
Thank you. I was wondering, how far can you push space opera as a genre when you start wanting to introduce magic and things like that into it?
So that would be space fantasy, Star Wars, things like that. We've published a few of those. I think that it's an easy meld, so to speak. The two pair very often, especially in film and television. So it's really about how far you want to take it. But I mean, as long as you're in space, running around, visiting other planets, and you spend a lot of time in space, I think that it is still a space opera, no matter how many magic knights and space wizards you have.
I would say that in some ways it's an artificial distinction. If you read, how many people out here have read Doc Ed Smith, the Linsman series? Okay. All that psionic stuff going on there, you know, is basically magic. If you read my In Fury Born, I actually introduce a Greek fury into an otherwise totally hard science universe. And I have to tell you that the first time that I felt like I was 10 feet tall and covered with curly hair, I was at a con with Roger Zelazny the month that that book came out, and he's sitting at the signing table beside me, and he says, I finished, the original novel was Path of the Fury, which was then expanded with a prequel bound into the same cover. He said, I finished Path of the Fury last night. And I'm like, oh my God, Roger Zelazny read my book. Oh shit, what's he gonna say? And I'm so like, and what did you think of it? And he said, I will never forget this. He said, I think it may be the best fusion of fantasy and science fiction I have ever read. And I said, ha ha. Maybe I can do this after all. But the thing is that a lot of people reading that book never notice the fantasy aspect of it at all, even though there's a Greek fury involved because of the way it's folded into what else is going on. You see what I'm saying? In a lot of ways, we are still telling the fairy tales of a pre-technic age, but we are now using technic tropes to do it. Instead of wizards, we have cyberneticists. Instead of demon familiars, we have AIs. They're filling very much the same slot. We're just getting them there using different avenues.
Speaking on that, if you guys are familiar with the Mass Effect series, it's a video game series, pretty popular in the 2000s. They have magic users, but they don't actually have magic users. They're grown up, there was like an accident with dark matter that infected all these kids, and then, when the kids grew up, they became these magic users. So, like, you can blend sci-fi and fantasy fairly easily if you just, hand wave some of the more technical aspects of it and how they got their powers and that sort of thing. Or you can just straight up say that there are space elves, So there's a wide range of ways of doing that and blending those two genres.
You can write any book that you want, just as long as when you put your cover on there and you write your book descriptions, you hint at it so the right reader will read it, and not the people who are not looking for magic in their space opera universe.
Well, and you have to be sure that whatever you're doing, that you maintain continuity on your way through, and that all the aspects of your technology, whether it's magic-based or based on nuclear physics, has limitations that you observe, that you limit your characters to. The limitations are more important than what they can do. What they can't do is more important than what they can in many respects. And I would also ask you all to remember Clark's Law, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Okay, if you want to push the boundaries on your technology far enough, you can give your characters what amount to magical powers that are simply based on things in many cases that we know are theoretically possible, but have no clue how to actually do yet.
All right, we're going to let Josh answer because I can tell he's got something to say, and then we're going to get to the next question.
I pretty much covered that in my first answer about what is space opera, but yeah, all I would say to that is introducing fantastical elements, magic is okay. Like Ken said, make sure your story description kind of tells the reader what they can expect. Build your system and stick to the rules that you made. If you create new magic halfway through to get yourself out of a bind, that's going to piss the readers off. So.
You can do that, but then you have to go back and modify your template from the beginning so that that magic was actually there all along, okay?
Who's next? What do we got?
This, I think, is along the same lines as what you were just talking about. I was wondering how you would gauge how forgiving the space opera audience is. I've got a series that I just got the rights back to. When it was originally published, they kept trying to shoehorn it in as a Space Marine, and there were lots of good reviews, but there was tons of reviews that this isn't Space Marine, there's no military battles in space, and I kind of always thought it was space opera, but it's also near future and somewhat dystopian. So if I was to publish it as a space opera, do you think the fans are forgiving enough that they're not going to read it and go, well, this isn't what I expected?
I think if your description is clear about what the story is, that they are forgiving enough for that.
I will tell you that I did a novella for an anthology that George Martin was editing, Out of the Dark, okay? And Tom Doherty at 20Books liked it so much that he asked me to expand it into a full novel, which I did. And Chris Kennedy and I have now done 2 sequels to it, the second of which has just been delivered. I had a whole bunch of people who were really pissed with me when they hit like the last quarter of the book and realized that one of the characters I'd introduced early on was Vlad Dracula. Okay, and the vampires basically rip out the throats of the alien invaders in the end of it. Well, if you get to book 2, you find out that he's not a vampire. He just thought he was a vampire because what happened to him back in the 15th century, that was the only explanation he had for it. But he's not really a vampire. He just thinks he is. Okay, but really like, oh, man, you brought in the damn vampires. Boy, you lost me, kind of thing. And that can happen. It doesn't matter if you're an established author or a new author. An established author has a better chance of weathering the storm when that happens. But part of the problem is if you're traditionally published like me, it's that a lot depends on how the publisher markets it. If you're self-published or you're with an indie house, you have more control over how the marketing is presented in many cases. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. I have found overall that I think most of the traditional houses do a pretty good job. I happen to think Baen does a better job than most, but that's because Baen kind of occupies a middle space. It's not corporate owned, it's a small house, it's an independent house, and therefore it has more in common with you guys than it does with, say, Scribner and Sons, if you see what I'm saying. So I guess I've gone to a halfway house to recover, I guess.
All right, we're going to jump to the next question because I see there's a line.
Yeah, this is for David Weber. I was frustrated when the Honor Harrington came out because it wasn't published fast enough. So.
Excuse me, could you write faster?
Yeah. But really, what my question is when you came up with your character and the first book, had you already thought about how expansive that universe was, or how much did you start with, and how much just grew into?
I wrote an 85,000-word essay about the Honorverse before I wrote the first word of the first novel. Okay? It was the first time that I had set out to plan a book as the first book in a series rather than it's just happening. One of the things that I'm sure many of you have discovered is that when you finish a novel, you realize that you have just set up the groundwork for the next one, because it's spinning off of what happened in this one. The characters have changed, they've grown, the situation has changed. By the time I started writing on Basilisk Station, I knew the history of the Honorverse to that point. I had an essay on what the technical capabilities were. I had the mechanics of the diaspora. I had a bunch of stuff worked out. And I have expanded the Tech Bible as I went along, and Tom Pope now is actually the keeper of my Tech Bible. I call him up and say, what did I do with the missiles? Now, I have an updated version that for every novel, it's Honor Harrington's Universe as of, and there's the title of the novel so that it's bookmarked, so I know anything that I added is in here, if you follow me. But in answer to your question, I knew essentially where the series was going from the get-go. It did take one major left turn in that I expected Honor to die about halfway through it, and I didn't not kill her. That's actually a correct construction. I didn't not kill her because I decided that I couldn't stand for her to die. It was because Eric Flint and I had done a collaboration that had pulled other events forward, and there wasn't time to reach the resolution I would have needed after her death. So I needed to keep her around to deal with it. I'm not going to pretend that broke my heart, you understand. But that was the way. I think readers would have forgiven me for the way that she would have died and how it would have worked out. But it did create another problem, and this is, it pertains to space opera and to writing in general, which is, in my original concept, there was supposed to be another 25 years for the Solarian League to get a clue and begin equalizing the tech imbalance with Manticore and its allies. So what I wound up with was a situation in which any naval encounter was basically going to be a curb stomp for the good guys, unless I could really come up with a way to, shift the odds or whatever. Getting my feet back under me and continuing with the series when I realized that I had that problem was difficult, because it changed the entire balance of where I was planning on going. But as far as people fussing at me for not getting them written, I say to them, okay, well, I can write more of that, but then I have to write less of this series. No, don't stop writing that series, kind of thing. So I'm like, okay, fine, I don't have a pica, I just have to do the best I can, But thank you.
Can we jump to the next question?
Hi. I'm not going to ask a writery question because I write urban fantasy. I'm just a fan of space opera. So this is just for everybody. What was the author or book that made you want to write space opera?
All right, let's start down there with Ken and then move down.
Well, he's sitting right here. Somebody, when I was in my 30s, threw me a David Weber book, Off Armageddon Reach, and I was like, holy crap, I didn't even know they wrote books like this, and boom, I was in.
I actually didn't find David until late in my reading career, so it's not him, it was E.E. Doc Smith.
The very first science fiction novel I ever read at the tender age of 10 was The Legion of Space by Jack Williamson. That one didn't inspire me to write space opera, but what really inspired me to write space opera is the fact that I love history. And space opera is a better fit for somebody who wants to play with history than a lot of other types of science fiction.
Mine was a standalone novel called The Mind Pool by Charles Sheffield. And it has military elements, but it was really just kind of a funky mashup. It was, if you think of like Star Wars and Fifth Element and some cyberpunk elements built into that, it was, I remember reading that when I was a teenager, and it just kind of blew my mind, so that was what let me down.
When I was about 15, I wrote my first story ever, and I guess you could call it a space opera, but it was about discovering a spaceship in my backyard and flying off with my friends. But the first sci-fi book I read ever was Ender's Game a year later, and that was when I decided, because I couldn't get it out of my head for weeks, and then I had to decide on what to major in school, and I was like, I think I want to do that. So that was the book that did it for me.
I should clarify that I actually didn't start writing until a decade ago. I'm a reader that became a writer, so I fell in love with space opera with E.E. Doc Smith.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, my question is for everybody, anybody who has an answer, is do you find that there are any tropes that do surprisingly well within the space opera genre?
Ken?
Can you say the beginning part of that question again?
For anybody, are there any tropes that do surprisingly well within space opera?
Yes. Next. No.
Surprising, the tough qualifier.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, I tend to tilt towards the types of stories I like to read. So, you know, Star Wars came out. I was born in '74. It came out in '77, so it was in my life. So when you had the romance with Han and Leia, and you had, you know, Luke rising up, that was huge for me. So, you know, those types of hero journey is what resonates with me. It's to one degree or another that I include in most of my stories. So those tropes, there's a reason why Star Wars is one of the most widely known IP on the entire planet.
Terry?
Exploration is the one that does it for me. I like seeing people go to brand new places and exploring things that I would have never imagined.
We use tropes all the time. They're kind of a shorthand way of communicating with our audience. There are things that we know are going to resonate. There are also tropes that we learn that we really want to avoid that get used a lot. And I would say that is almost for me as big a factor in what I'm writing as the ones that I want to use. I don't know that I have a favorite trope. I think probably, I've said this before, the main characteristic of any hero or heroine in my books, the one that they all seem to share, is a sense of responsibility. So perhaps that would be my trope, the trope of the person rising to the responsibilities of an adult human being faced with a difficult situation.
Similar for me. The reluctant hero is probably my favorite trope. It gives you a lot of opportunity at the beginning to abuse your character, put them in conflicts, force them to grow, and it gives them something to aspire to and to rise to, and you can build a story around that a lot easier than, you know, a noble character from the very beginning.
So the question I would ask is, instead of like what tropes sell the best, because that's constantly changing, you know, like they come in waves, like bell bottoms, and you just, year to year, you don't know at the start of it, like what's going to be the next thing. So it's good to keep your finger on the pulse of the market, constantly watch and see what's performing and where the interest is. Ask your readers and see what it is about your writing and the tropes that you're implementing that seems to be resonating with them the most.
Let me add one thing. It's your voice that's going to make or break you as a writer, because that's what your readers are going to respond to. If there's a trope that works for you, okay, then incorporate it. Your readers will tell you if it doesn't, but you have to write the story that works for you, to have the voice that you're comfortable with, that is actually you and not you trying to respond to market forces. Never respond to market forces, ever. Okay, respond to what works for you as a writer and find your market.
We're going to take the next question. We've got 9 minutes left.
I'll try and keep it short. For books like the Fuzzy series from H. Bean Piper, you know, and Aller Uprising and Citizen of the Galaxy by Heinlein, would those be considered space opera, or how would you classify those? Because everything takes place on a single extraterrestrial planet. I mean, not Earth.
I think all of the ones that you mentioned have space opera implications, but I wouldn't consider those individual novels space opera. Okay, I think if Piper hadn't killed himself and if he had continued to expand the Fuzzy universe, it might very well have turned into space opera, but I don't know. Nobody will ever know.
Yeah, John Scalzi tried to remake it, and so I think that was like one book, but it didn't. Yeah, and I assume it didn't sell that well, which is why he probably didn't do more, but it's pretty good. I read it. I also would not consider that a space opera because, like you said, it's all on one planet. Next question.
Hi. Yeah, space opera, I've read a lot of books over many years, more than I care to count. And the thing that started to really turn me off on a lot of the science fiction genre was how grim things seemed to become, probably starting in the 90s, but maybe even before that. So I am very aware and very concerned about the lack of humor. And I'm not saying the wisecracking superhero type is something that's either good or bad, but I was interested to see what you considered to be the importance of having what may even be comic relief as part of the ongoing story when you have tension, 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 resolution, and then tension, 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 rinse and repeat.
Have humor, but don't go over the top with it.
Yeah, don't be over the top with it, but have people who recognize the absurdity of the situations that they find themselves in,
Yeah.
because they're naturally absurd when you're in a serious situation. Why am I here?
If done well, it can work.
Yes.
But it's all about the nuance.
Well, and I think also you need to remember that in the very best horror, there's also humor. It hasn't worn well. I went back to rewatch it and I couldn't get through it. But in my youth, there was a movie, American Werewolf in London. Okay? And there was a lot of humor in that. There was a lot of horror in that, and that's why it worked.
One last little thing, Mr. Weber said that there were tropes that he avoided like the plague. That really is very intriguing.
Oh, well, we don't want to go there.
It's got me in trouble last week.
We don't want to go there, especially if there are Star Trek fans in the audience. I'll just say that. Okay.
One of the things that I do want to say is that with having the dark and the gritty leavened by some humor, is it doesn't have to be funny. It doesn't have to be humor. You just can't be down and dark all the time. You've got to have hope. If you can put some hope into this, that's, in my mind, just as good.
Go ahead.
I like having friends fight each other because there's, that makes it really personal. You can have an enemy that's trying to kill you, that's personal. But when you and a close friend or loved one, significant other, fight on something, it has more intensity, but it could also lend itself to humor in ways because they know you. So those characters know each other very well and can, poke fun. It's like, I don't know if you remember the movie Armageddon. There's no good science in that movie, but one of the things that made it such a hit movie is that all those characters really knew each other. They had a history, and it just pulled you in, and it made you feel part of it. I think that definitely caters to your comment about not being so grim, even if you're in a grim circumstance.
We're going to have Josh answer this question, and then we're going to jump to the final question here,
Yeah.
and then we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, these guys cover it real well. The humor it can be a pressure relief valve. Like I said, when the scene or the story is just so grim and so dark, and it's really, it's almost painful to read. It's just there's no hope in it. Just, and I'm not saying something slapsticky like the Three Stooges come into the scene, but just a well-placed joke or something that'll just kind of break it a little bit can help.
All right, sorry, I know we're running about 4 minutes. Hey, first-time caller, long-time listener. Quick question with probably a longer answer. I know when I write, I tend to run for themes from history, things like Boudica and Alexander and Hannibal. When you're writing your books and looking at your battle scenes, do you reach for anything from history? If so, what?
You start, Dave.
All right. I don't tend to reach too much for history in specific battles. I tend to read. What I use history for is I take pieces of history to build the infrastructure for my universe. I usually don't lift entire societies or histories to do it. But I've read enough history that I have a pretty good feel for how human beings are going to react to a set of circumstances in a way that will be believable and acceptable to the reader, because that's the way humans have reacted for several thousand years to those factors. So to that extent, yes, there's a lot of borrowing from history in the books. There's also borrowing from history many times and evolving the model for the combat.
I am not a history buff in that I know all of the battles of history, but I try to set the circumstances of the fighting up based on the story as it is right there, and try to figure out what would make sense for the people to do and go from there. Rather than pulling it from history, I just try to pull from circumstance and common sense.
I can tell you, Terry Maggart, who unfortunately isn't here, is a former history professor. So you can imagine the phone calls we have when we collaborate on a book. He wants to recreate this specific obscure scenario from 1,500 years ago and apply it to 4000 AD space battle, and it works surprisingly well. George R.R. Martin notoriously used this European war as a template for A Song of Ice and Fire, and that worked really well because a lot of people aren't familiar with that. So it's like War of the Roses, I think it was.
Let me add one thing here. You have to be
Wars of the
careful
Roses,
with this will work because it actually happened in history. Okay? You cannot write a novel in which your readership is going to accept that your characters were as stupid as the senior French command in the Franco-Prussian War.
Yeah.
Because it has to be credible to the reader. So you have to set up how you could wind up in the Battle of Sedan. And if you did it the way you really did it, nobody could be that dumb. Okay? So you have to watch out for that when you
Not
start
every
looking
battle
at history.
translates to a more sophisticated environment. Yeah. Do you want to take that one?
I was an engineer before I wrote, so I didn't go to school for history or writing. I usually would do research on like societal shifts, like falls of Roman Empire, things like that, trying to basically find out why did these huge civilizations, what started causing these collapses, and I try to kind of pull from that, because if you have a huge spacefaring society, how did that start to kind of implode and curl around the edges? And that's about as deep as I go with that.
Yeah, I think most galactic empires can reference back to Rome collapsing, and as we see often in space opera, even galactic empires spread across 1,000 worlds can fall.
Well, my background was in military and diplomatic history. I don't know if it shows in the books, but there's a whole bunch of material out there.
Oh, I was pointing to you for next. Yeah, sorry. There's nobody else over there.
Nope, I don't use history when I plan my space battles or my conflicts. It all goes to who wants what are they fighting over. It's the same. It's the same conflict that can exist between two people versus two countries versus certain schools of thought in a world. It's just on a galactic scale.
We're going to wrap this up now, but if anybody wants to swarm David after, by all means.
We'll hold him still for
We'll hold him
you.
down. He's got a cane, so watch out. But in all seriousness, if you have more questions, please ask. We have to end the panel, but there's always the hallway.
Do we have somebody else in the room after us? Do we know?
I don't know.
Because I'm thinking we're getting towards the end of the. Yeah, so,
Okay.
I can hang around if you can hang around, but we would be done, it wouldn't be official anymore.
Oh, yeah, if you have another question. I mean, we can keep going until they stop us.
Yeah, writers love to talk about writing. It's crazy.
Well, I just heard the term galactic empire, and that the galaxy is so huge. Yeah, I mean, you got to have some really fast ships. What is your attitude about? I mean, how big can your empire be realistically within your worlds?
I think the most common would be a galactic empire, so something strictly to one galaxy. You can always reference those different classes of civilizations, type 1, type 2, type 3.
Yeah.
On a flip point, you can have lots of small countries name themselves really grandiosely. You can have a galactic empire that is not really as big as a galaxy.
Well, and it depends on the technology you're going to give them. The critical technology is communication speed. In the Honorverse, for example, the only way to get a message from one star system to another is by a ship. And that means that it's going to take X number of days, weeks, months, whatever, for the message to make transit. In the Path of the Fury universe, by the time you get to Alicia DeVries, they have an interstellar faster than light communications technology that's almost instantaneous over vast distances. That defines how integrated your society can be, and that defines how stable it can be, and how large it can be.
That's pretty much, I have one series, and it's defined by the communications are superluminal drones. They have to go back and forth. So it's pretty small. It's just one little chunk of the Orion arm. One has the superluminal broadcasts, so it's more of a kind of a quarter chunk of the galaxy. But so
The great thing about creating worlds and galaxies is that your technology should evolve. So if you don't have the capability in the beginning, there's no reason why you can't learn it.
Yeah.
You know.
One of the things that people forget too often when they're writing on the grand scale over long periods of time is to allow for the evolution of the tech base. Now, you can come up with a situation in which the tech has plateaued, okay, and it can be really useful to do that, as that's where my story is starting from. It plateaued, and now the plateau has broken, okay? But you can also come up with artificial and realistic, well, not realistic, but material-defined reasons why the tech is frozen at a given level. I've never really enjoyed that kind of story as a storyteller, but it can be done effectively.
If you've got aliens in your work, some of the Last Hunter stuff that I'm writing now, they've got aliens they didn't encounter before, and some of the technology that they found ingenious ways of mixing their own with it and coming up with unusual effects.
Next question.
I actually was really pleased to hear Galactic Empires, the term brought up, because, you know, that opener, what is space opera, and for a very long time that was one of the characteristics that tended to set it apart from hard science, because your hard scientists would tell you there's no way you can hold a large government together across multiple star systems because of the speed of light. And popping back into the history realm, all of the issues in Europe during some of the various religious wars, where there were how large can an empire be when your couriers travel by horse and you don't know that you've got a schism in the church way over here that is going through and raising other villages and converting them. There used to be a couple of anthologies called Galactic Empires, and that was a lot of the early space operas seemed to deal with that. It got too big, it's collapsing, and we're seeing these edges and breakaways. And then that stopped. Do you think that's something that could come back to the fore? Because I don't see much of that sort of decaying empire vibe these days.
Yeah, it's still around, mostly in indie fiction. But Hyperion comes to mind, the Hyperion Cantos, or whatever it's called. I believe that's still ongoing, I think, yeah. Anyway, next question. This is the last one, then we gotta go.
Yeah. David, yesterday in one of your panels, you talked about losing your reader if you reach violence saturation. I'm summarizing much longer. But would you expound on that? You kept me up last night trying to think through that.
Okay, this is not necessarily specifically space opera. It definitely applies to military science fiction, and it can apply to space opera, especially if space opera has a military component. What he was talking about is, I mentioned the fact that 90% of your audience has no personal experience with violence. And therefore, any understanding they have of violence is vicarious. It's through what they've seen in movies, read in books, seen in the news, what you're communicating to them. And that means that you have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to communicate that violence to them in a way that is not sugar-coated, isn't homogenized, isn't blended over, and doesn't lose its impact. Okay, some people operate on the theory that since no one can write combat as bad as it really is, I'll write it as bad as I possibly can. And so you have this incredible amount of violence, you have bloodshed everywhere. When you do that, one thing is that you have to be allowing for the psychological stress, the cost to your participants, but you also have to be aware that you reach a burnout stage with your audience. You desensitize them to the violence by hitting them with it so much that you normalize the violence, which is not what you want to do. It's from where I sit, that's immoral, but it's also bad storytelling, because what you are doing to your reader is causing what's supposed to have major impact on him to no longer have impact. All right? So you don't want to write splatter porn if you're going to write military fiction, but you do have to have a cost for the individuals involved, and that means that you have to show the consequences of violence. And I think that's what you were, where'd you go? Okay. Oh, there he is. I think that's what you were getting at. Yes.
All right, we have to wrap this. Oh, go ahead.
Well, let me just one of the reasons that I came so late to your work, David, is an associate kept recommending that I read Honor Harrington because, quote, everyone dies. And so I was like, why would I want to read this?
Well, one of the things about combat, unfortunately, is that people do die. And you have to, if you're going to write military fiction, you have to be willing to let characters people care about die, because the characters in the book care about people who die. And if you don't communicate that to your reader, if you don't have enough respect for your characters to let your readers feel the grief your characters feel, then you have shortchanged everybody, the characters and the reader. That means that the reader has to understand why the characters in the book are devastated by losing this person to what may be almost a random, the shell that landed in the wrong place. Don Gentili, the ace of aces in World War II for the U.S. military, died in the crash of a civilian P-51 only about 4 years after the end of the war. Survived countless combat missions, had more air-to-air victories than any other American in the European theater of war, and he died in a plane crash. George Patton was killed in an automobile accident that he died from. So, people die for reasons that make zero sense. And sometimes you have to communicate that to your reader too, so that they understand that the guy who was with you at breakfast this morning before you flew the mission to Haiphong didn't come back, and you don't even have any idea where he got shot down or what happened to him. That's part of what the military is about. And you need to be honest with your reader and share that with them.
All right, we have to wrap this up, though, for real this time. But thank you all for coming, and thank you for being a part of the genre. Space opera means a lot to everybody up here, as I'm sure it does to you, and we're going to keep writing, and I hope you do too.